Great, thanks very much. Nice to have a different perspective from up here, and I think it's also terrific to follow the Asian Development Bank. Oftentimes when we're talking about ports and funding, we often look around and want to make sure that there's funders and people at the table that can help us move things forward. And so with the focus on which we just had on Asia, now let's shift to the east side of the Pacific, and I'm going to talk a little bit about what we've been doing at the Port of San Diego. I'm going to set the context a little bit with some orientation about the port, focusing on how we've traditionally looked at plans and policies as our foundation to go after and attract funding and plan for the future around a lot of the same topics we've been talking about over the last couple days. But then I'm going to show you how at the Port of San Diego about 10 years ago, we decided to look at things a little bit differently and not just look at our established systems and how we can support those, but how we can perhaps pivot and not just support established industry, but do what we can do within San Diego to focus on incubating and supporting innovation at the port level, testing it in San Diego, and then hopefully creating pathways for scale for solutions. So for those of you that are not familiar with San Diego, we're in the southwest corner of the United States. We're in a border region. Actually, from the port headquarters, it's probably only about a 25-minute drive down to the border. Our jurisdiction, if you look at this map, is actually mostly submerged lands. And although we are a port authority with a variety of different industries that are a part of our portfolio, in 2020, another 8,300 acres of land was granted to the Port of San Diego by the state of California to manage essentially the center of the bay, because we were established in 1962 as a special district, which previously was managed by the 5 cities that you see around San Diego Bay. There were 5 cities traditionally that had different portions of San Diego Bay that they were responsible for, and the 5 cities up there is obviously San Diego, Chula Vista, National City, Imperial Beach, as well as Coronado. So with that vision of a unified port that forms the philosophy of a lot of what we do, we really focus on advancing integrated management for around San Diego Bay. We manage 34 miles of shoreline. Inside the bay, there's about another 16, and for the most part, that's managed by our federal partners, primarily the U.S. Navy. And they're a very important partner. Our governance structure, I just want to highlight on this very simply, because just like I mentioned, there's 5 member cities that make up the Port of San Diego, and we have a 7-member board that's appointed by the various city councils from those 5 cities. The largest member is San Diego with 3 representatives, and then the 4 other cities each have 1 commissioner. I'm joined at the conference, and many of you have probably had a chance to meet the secretary of the board, Dr. Gil Anthony Ungab, who's also our resident doctor on the commission, which is interesting. First doctor that we've had. We tend to have a lot of experience in and around real estate and law, labor, and so it's important, especially coming from my background with more of a science and policy background. It's great to have someone with a public health background joining our board. So I've talked a little bit about San Diego as a unified port, and that really is embedded in our original governing legislation that set the port up in 1962. We have this really unique mission. Yes, we're a port, but I also think about this. The map I showed you, we're also a little bit of a resource agency. We're responsible for maintaining and managing a lot of resources in and around San Diego Bay from a natural resources standpoint, as well as taking care of all the port-related assets and infrastructure. We were set up to essentially have a 5-path mission to promote navigation in and around San Diego Bay, promoting commerce in everything that comes with that, and we've got a really broad portfolio of commerce that we're responsible for. Our largest book of business actually is commercial real estate, so think hotels, restaurants, marinas, shipyards, boatyards, as well as a robust history in maritime. We've been talking obviously a lot about maritime. We both support a cargo and cruise business, along with what at one point was the largest commercial fishery in the 1950s around tuna fishing. Since then, we've transitioned in our fishing part of the business from commercial fishing to supporting the largest sport fishing fleet on the West Coast. And that is based on our positioning. We have some great opportunities, not just to do local sport fishing in San Diego, but there's a lot of trips that end up going down to Mexico. If you've ever been to San Diego and you're into sport fishing, you can either do a half-day tour, or the longest tours that we have from some of the sport fishing landings. The longest one is 18 days. So if you're really an avid fisherman, you come to San Diego and enjoy that. And I give you all that as background because one of our main charges at the port is to support the regional economic, the regional economy. And this is a bit of a dated statistic now, but from 2023, the contribution that we make, both direct and indirect, from a multiplier effect is pretty significant. When you look at some of the highest paying maritime jobs, most of those are at the waterfront, and the port doesn't just focus on those side of things, but we're also looking at what we can do to bring and grow additional business in and around San Diego. But it's not just about running the business. We have, like most of you in the room, we've got lots of plans and policies that have been in effect for a while. I will say the examples I'm going to run through are relevant to some things that we've been doing in and around our climate action platform. And we've built plans around maritime decarbonization. We've been doing this on the climate change standpoint, the greenhouse gas emissions reduction, for about 20 years, whether it's emissions reduction focused on dealing with the cumulative issue of greenhouse gas emissions or focused on local air quality. We have put together plans in a way to not just set targets for where we want to go, but we've done it in a way to attract also traditional investment. So we've identified what our goals should be, how we want to get there with operational improvements. We've done that through a maritime clean air strategy. In addition to that, we have assets that we have to maintain along the waterfront. So in addition to looking at our mitigation strategies in terms of emissions, we have put a lot of time and energy into the adaptation side of climate action planning, really thinking about coastal resilience and coastal hazards. We have worked extremely closely with our Navy partners, and let's see, 7 years ago, we worked with Navy Region Southwest, and we came to an agreement through an MOU to share scenario planning around sea level rise and coastal hazards, because in many places, our installations abut port operations, and we need to make sure that we're planning for our assets in coordination with the Navy, because we don't want to do something that adversely impacts them and vice versa. And the third thing from the climate action platform standpoint, so we've covered mitigation, adaptation. We're also beginning to look at that natural resource of San Diego Bay and whether or not we can unlock some value in sequestration. Within San Diego Bay, that graphic I showed, there's a little over 11,000 acres of submerged lands we manage. Inside the bay, we have 1,900 acres of eelgrass. There's another 700 in jurisdiction just outside the entrance to San Diego Bay. And we've been spending more time really understanding what the sequestration benefit is within the sediment in and around eelgrass. And we've worked with our partners at NOAA and MARAD to help us study the effects and benefit of that. Although it's marginal compared to the benefits that we get from reducing direct emissions, it's essentially the third leg of the stool that makes up our climate action platform. I'm just going to give you a little bit of a background with some examples of those three areas that I covered. This is an example of what we've just done in the last 5 years. In 2019, we started this effort to put together a maritime clean air strategy. It took us about 2 years to go through the development of that strategy. It was adopted in 2021. And since that time, we have focused on a portfolio approach to reduce sources, not just singularly, which we had started with low-hanging fruit, obviously focusing on energy efficiency and making sure that our facilities and buildings were running as efficiently as they could. But through the Maritime Clean Air Strategy, we identified our 7 main sources, so trucks, rail, vessels, cargo handling equipment, our own fleet, to name a few, and started putting down waypoints for what we wanted to achieve in both the near and long term. And what you can see here, just in the last 5 years, we have pretty significant reductions. If you go back to where we first started looking at emissions reductions, which was really in the mid-2000s, these reductions more than double. So fast forwarding to where we are now, and how it segues into a discussion about innovation, we have a very supportive board that has asked us to kind of lean into ideas, lean into taking a little bit of risk with industry and our partners to try to pilot ideas and solutions in San Diego that hopefully, if they're successful, then can be scaled not just locally, but then they can be exported to other ports and harbors. And this graphic just shows a few of those things that we've done in San Diego. The picture of the 2 cranes, the 2 ultra heavy lift mobile harbor cranes. Before that, we had a lift capacity that was almost 100 metric tons. Between these 2 cranes together now, it allows us to have the highest lift capacity on the West Coast, and combined they can lift together 400 metric tons. And it's interesting because not only are they battery powered, but which allows them to move from place to place when they're plugged in for operation. When there's that massive power draw, they're also connected to systems that we are expanding along our 10th Avenue Marine Terminal. So no matter where they are, they can operate on electric power. That is also supported through a program we worked on with the California Energy Commission several years ago, where we worked to deploy the first ever microgrid that provides both solar power as well as battery electric storage on the terminal. It helps us from an islanding standpoint. If there's inconsistencies with the grid, we can allow our administration facilities at the terminals to maintain operations, as well as security and lighting. And we also provide jet fuel to the airport, which is pretty close to our 10th Avenue Marine Terminal. It allows us to be resilient when we're facing challenges like that. And then finally, the only other thing I want to point out, I had a couple conversations with some of you that were curious about what we're doing from electric hovercraft, and we worked with ABB and as well as Crowley, and they were able to engineer, develop, and deploy the first all-electric tug that was deployed in San Diego. And it's interesting, people say, well, why did you pick San Diego to test this out? Well, uniquely, I'll kind of compare us to our partners up in the Pacific Northwest. When you start looking at technology like this, it's easier to test it in an environment where you don't have to have such long pilotage distances. And we have a pretty short entrance into the harbor to land and berth at the 10th Avenue Marine Terminal, compared to perhaps the Puget Sound that has a much longer pilotage distance. So they're just a couple of the things that we've been doing on the emissions reduction standpoint in terms of advancing zero emission technologies. But I want to briefly hit on these 2 other aspects of our climate action platform, the second of which really focuses on adaptation. So San Diego Bay, we've got all sorts of shorelines. We've got natural shorelines, hybrid shorelines, armored shorelines, and we have almost every type of shoreline that exists in San Diego County with the exception of large bluffs that we have further up the coast. But all of these shorelines have varying degrees of vulnerabilities. And ports, as you all know, are squeezed between 2 areas of encroachment. We're squeezed between the coast, as well as we're in a very urban location. So there's not very many places where we can retreat to. So that makes it really, really important to understand how we can maintain, improve our shoreline to make sure that the long-term viability of the port remains. This is an example of a study we did several years back. Actually, we did it in combination with our regional collaborators at universities as well as the Navy. And what this shows, these pictures on the, I guess it's on my left, show areas in and around the port that are inundated on a dry weather high tide, king tide. We have king tides typically through November through February, but it's interesting, we had a king tide just this past August in these same areas, this past July, and these same areas flooded during a king tide that was not during the extremes that we tend to experience between November and February. So when you start looking at the conditions today, it gives us a good opportunity to look at this as an active laboratory and start thinking about how can we prepare not just for protecting the assets that we have today, but how can we integrate that with our plans? How can we start thinking about buildings and elevations and not just things above the surface of the land, but then if we've got vaulted equipment or if we're focusing on making improvements, especially with electrification improvements at the terminals, and you heard from an earlier presentation, the issues with exposure to corrosion and making sure that all those systems are maintained in a way that has optimal functionality. So there's no shortage of challenges when it comes to dealing with coastal hazards. So we have embraced, let me push this again, not just understanding things from a conceptual planning level, but we're actively engaged with deploying monitoring equipment and sensors, so we have a really more comprehensive understanding of what's happening, not just during one-time events when we go out and take sampling, but the idea is how do we get from that to real-time monitoring to a point that then if there is an incident, that data can be uploaded and transmitted directly to perhaps our emergency operations center in the event that there is some type of emergency. We're also using this as the basis and foundation for us to start testing and piloting new solutions in San Diego, and using those pilots to figure out ways to permit unique ideas that maybe haven't been permitted before. And we say this a lot. We're looking not just at traditional solutions, but we're really looking at what we can do to embrace the world's greatest engineer, right, Mother Nature, and how we can take inspiration from Mother Nature to make ourselves more resilient in the future. And when you talk about this with anyone from the federal level, whether it be at the Army Corps of Engineers and concepts of engineering with nature, all the way to resource agencies in California, in concept, people really like nature-based solutions. But the challenge whenever you're proposing to do something new is what's the permitting pathway to do something new that people haven't seen before. So we're focusing on making sure that we're taking important first steps where we're looking at collecting data and information and testing ideas on a smaller scale. This slide just shows some examples of some of the things we're doing. I mentioned eelgrass already, which is a tremendous resource that we have in San Diego Bay, but we've also tried some other novel ideas. We have deployed a native oyster reef, which is made up of those circular reef balls that you see in the middle. This was actually supported and funded partially by a grant through the California Coastal Conservancy. And those shells are made up of, those reef balls are made up of 50% oyster shells, crushed oyster shells. And the idea is for them to be deployed, they were deployed in 6 different arrays, and over time, they will fill in with oysters. The idea is also to support growth of the native Olympia oyster population to create an artificial reef between a very low-lying area in our South Bay. So that's an example of how we are looking at protecting low-lying areas. And we saw the presentation yesterday about the, I'm going to probably pronounce it wrong, but the Acropon example for the glass jetty reconstruction and rebuild. We're not doing things to that scale in San Diego, but that third picture is an example where we developed with a company called eConcrete, something which is essentially an interlocking tide pool. So we're in the process of replacing active rock with a ecological solution. And I've got a couple slides and a case study that I'm going to dig a little bit deeper into this example. This first slide is just a little bit of a tease to show you what are some of the examples that we're pursuing from a nature-based solution standpoint. And if they're successful, not only could they potentially provide ecological uplift, but we're also in the early stages of doing research into whether or not the replacement of traditional gray infrastructure could actually be monetized through an ecological credit, a water quality credit. If it's not a credit that can be sold, perhaps we can at least demonstrate the value ecologically or from a water quality standpoint to attract dollars to invest and replace our shoreline. Like I said in the beginning, we have about 35 miles of armored shoreline. All of that has to be replaced. And that's not unique to San Diego. That's a story for all of you who work in ports all around the globe. And most of that original first-generation infrastructure was built, for the most part, in the middle of last century. If you even look at the improvements that we are seeing here in Guam on the breakwater, the story in terms of its life cycle is about the same. So with that as a background, about 10 years ago, we decided to look at, from the port's business portfolio, what could we do not just to support the growth of those ones from an established industry standpoint, but what could we do to support emerging industries? And the bottom half of this slide shows where we have been actively listening, looking for partners to support innovation in and around some of the things I touched on already, nature-based solutions, but also and coastal resiliency, but also looking at maritime decarbonization, ocean data, environmental remediation, just to name a few. And so we set up a really unique program in 2016, which we call our Blue Economy Incubator. It's not an incubator from the standpoint of a brick and mortar building that startups can come and set up in. There's other ports that do that. There's Alta Sea at Port of LA. There's our partners, Washington Maritime Blue, that partners with the state of Washington, further up the coast in the Pacific Northwest. But our value proposition really is about providing expertise related to the permitting process, as well as being able to provide some direct funding and investment for startups, but more importantly, getting these projects in the water and to be testing. So like I said, we launched this program in 2016. So the value proposition behind the incubator includes port investment if it's needed, locations to test these pilots, as well as our subject matter expertise. And we have been focusing on building a global network of collaborators who have similar types of problems that they're looking to solve and to help connect them to the larger blue economy ecosystem. And it's interesting because we used to provide grant funding, for example, from the port to novel ideas related to research. And then we just started looking at it from the standpoint of, well, that's nice, but what's the multiplier effect? Could we, in fact, start investing in some of these ideas and potentially having an upside for the port plus the businesses, and then be able to reinvest that into the next solution of ideas? And so in the 10 years we've been around with this program, 3 of them, actually, we didn't make any investments pre and post COVID. So we took about a 3-year break from investments. We have a pretty modest portfolio of projects that have been accepted into the program. We've got 14 pilots. We've deployed a little over $3 million in funding, but the interesting thing there is the payback just in terms of additional grant funding that has come towards those companies and the port for expansion is almost 3 to 1. Like I mentioned, we have 14 pilots, but they're not all active right now. We have seven that are active, and everything that's on this slide are the ones that we're actively working on implementation, from aquaculture to the coastal lock system I showed you a slide or two ago, as well as 2 companies that are focused on helping us build out our ocean intelligence programs. And there's 3 more at the end there. There's a really novel idea for powering marinas and vessels in marinas, as well as 2 concepts I'm going to talk about in a couple of the case studies. So I'm going to go through 4 of these very briefly to give you a little bit of an idea of what's the value to the port, what's the value to the company, and maybe it'll spark an idea that you've been thinking about for your own ports and harbors as ways that, whether you're a consultant or you're an administrator at a port, can start embracing innovation, especially with small and medium-sized companies that have some terrific ideas, but what they don't have is access. And so in 2019, we made a novel, and there was a novel idea, like I mentioned, this coastal lock system that was intended to replace riprap. And like I said, everyone kind of liked the idea of a nature-based solution, but gosh, try to permit it. That's a whole nother story. But if you can permit it in California, good chances are you can probably permit it in most places in the world. So we made an initial investment in 2019, and with that initial investment, we also had to commit that if it didn't work, that we'd replace it with the riprap that we took out. But it was more successful than we could have imagined. We deployed 160 linear feet on Harbor Island, which is very close to the San Diego airport. We had 2 sites, as well as a control site, and essentially what we have seen now, almost 7, 8 years later, is we have a lot of both plants and animals that have moved into that community. The secret is not just the design, which simulates tide pools, but there's a special cement additive that actually changes the pH value, that makes it more biophilic, so both plants and animals gravitate and actually attach to the system, and creates essentially an exoskeleton. So from an engineering standpoint, not only do we have the strength and the integrity of the original blocks, but it actually has a stronger skeleton on the outside. And on top of that, we've seen, I know it says this project since San Diego has been deployed in 50 different countries, and then from a standpoint of species diversity and abundance, we have 60 additional species on this site compared to the control site, which is the riprap. A couple other ideas that I just want to showcase. There's a company, and Jane's pretty familiar with a few of these companies because we've been spending a lot of time north of the border in Canada, because their federal government spends a lot of time and money and energy on the front end supporting emerging businesses, and we see a lot of value north of the border, and bringing those ideas to San Diego has been successful. The first of which is VaultSafe. It's a company that developed a system instead of a plug-in for marinas. It's just like you could imagine for a lot of your cell phones, wireless charging. What this has done, there's essentially a magnetic locking system that allows boaters to also have access to their charging on through an app on their phone. They can see how much their vessel has charged, and they're able to do that remotely. But some things that have been offered through our port is there's also a benefit of additional media coverage. And when you are able to, when you're a startup company, you just don't necessarily have the same access. And so some of you might not know this, but from a port standpoint, all of you have at least someone who's thinking about communications, and the larger ports have pretty robust programs. And the power of promoting those companies and those solutions as well as your own port is pretty significant. So we've had some great opportunities to take advantage of promoting companies through our communications department. So moving away from some of the more traditional ideas, right? So we've got charging at marinas, we've got replacing the shoreline. We partnered with another company out of British Columbia, which is called Lux Bio. And the power of their product is they are taking on the chemiluminescence industry, and they have identified how to package bioluminescence, essentially encapsulating the enzyme luciferase that then reacts when it interacts with water. And we're working with them to test 3 different models, one of which is going to be from a surf and rescue standpoint, primarily with our harbor police divers, and they'll be able to use these bioluminescence glow sticks in those situations. We're also looking at doing a pilot with commercial fishing research company out of Oceanside, which is just north of downtown San Diego, and replacing what is traditionally used with chemical luminescence and plastic encasements with biodegradable encasements. And when you think about how many of these light sticks are used from a commercial fishing standpoint, it's in the millions. We're also looking, you've probably all seen them at Halloween or at kids' events, right? These glow sticks that, like I said, are filled with chemicals as opposed to what's being used in this case, which is essentially water and an enzyme. We're also looking at how we might be able to use them at some fun special events around the bay. Getting back to something a little bit more traditional, there's lots of solutions out there which are looking to collect and build on our sensor and monitoring equipment, sensor and monitoring data. There's a company out of Victoria, British Columbia that we've partnered with called Marine Labs, and we're working with them to help us understand wave, tidal, and wake information in and around San Diego Bay. That's why I showed those pictures a little bit earlier in the presentation. We have a lot of soft shorelines, and there's a lot of, whether it's natural or from wakes, we want to have better and more information real time about how those areas are getting impacted, so then when we're developing engineering solutions, we're more prepared. So far, they've deployed 5 of their own buoys, and next step, we're working with the U.S. Coast Guard, and the idea is to deploy this equipment also on Coast Guard ATONs, 5 of those in and around San Diego Bay. And I bring these up as examples because often as ports, we're in a position where we're partnering with federal, state, local partners and industry, and we can provide that connective tissue to deploy some of these really unique, interesting ideas. But we're not just focused on traditional things that ports are involved in. We're also looking at what we can do to create new pathways for products like aquaculture. We spend a little bit of time with a company called Sunken Seaweed, which was created by 2 marine ecologists out of a local university in San Diego State University. And we worked with them to see whether or not there's an opportunity to grow culinary seaweed in San Diego Bay. We started there, but then they were also successful securing additional money to look at the bioremediation opportunities for seaweed in San Diego Bay. And we started with an initial investment that you saw on the screen of $137,000, and they were the first company that we actually reinvested in. And now they're looking at how they can develop their tumboculture with a vertically integrated company up in Humboldt Bay. And that signaled to us that there's opportunities for us to partner with other ports, because we may not have all the facilities and assets to help these different companies scale, but there's different ports with different assets and different geographies that support different companies in ways that we cannot. And so we maintained the investment to do some additional research in San Diego Bay while they built out their seaweed tumboculture in Humboldt Bay. So that just gives you a little bit of an idea of some of the companies that we've are actively working with, but like I mentioned, that last one was the first time we reinvested. And so we are looking at ways that we can provide access to US markets, to our international partners, as well as developing homegrown innovation with US companies. But when you look at the global blue economy, there's a lot of focus on the North Atlantic and the Mediterranean. When you start looking at the Pacific, there's an enormous amount of innovation, but based on geography and a few other externalities, I think as a region, we've got the innovation, but we're playing a little bit of catch up. So the Port of San Diego is here at APP to connect with people, but we're also focusing on what we can do to promote and advocate partnerships across the Pacific, both the North and South. We've got a lot of upcoming engagement. This slide just shows some of those opportunities over the next couple months that we'll be engaged with. And finally, what I gave you is a pretty high-level summary of some of the things that we're doing in and around innovation at the Port of San Diego. Every year we put together a highlights report where you can learn a lot more and read more specifics about what we're doing with each of these companies and where we plan to go. We actually just released this report last month, and if you want to learn any more about it, here's a code you could download on your phone, or at a break, I'm happy to talk to any of you about it.